Welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work of social justice.
Each week, we'll bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. Mm-hmm. And Aaron, my friend, you're up this week.
Yeah.
What have you brought to the table today?
I'm bringing a couple of articles about the Stop Cop City movement in Atlanta.
Yeah.
So the first was written by Micah Herskind, published by Prism. It's called The Fight to Stop Cop City Has Decades-Old Roots. And so that article explores some of the history of exploitation, gentrification, and increased policing in Atlanta in the lead up to the 1996 Olympic Games and makes the connections between that movement work and the work by the forest defenders currently.
Yes.
The second one is written by David Peisner. It's published by the Bitter Southerner back in December 2022, and it's called The Forest for the Trees. And this article dives into the history of the use of the land from the 60s and 70s, I think, when it was called the Atlanta Prison Farm,
right,
or when that's what it was known as.
Yep.
And then explores a variety of perspectives in Atlanta about the quote, public safety training center, from the forest defenders to the local council members to some local residents, and explains some of the processes that have led folks in Atlanta to this moment, including diving into like the city owning this parcel of land,
yes,
but the parcel of land actually existing in unincorporated DeKalb County,
right,
which is neighboring to Atlanta city limits. So who gets to weigh in on those decisions is weird.
Yeah, murky,
Yeah. And so all of that, right? And that's a longer piece. It goes into a lot of different kinds of things.
Yes.
I thought it was really a great article to read through.
Yeah.
But one thing I want to mention about it before we get into these is that article in the Bitter Southerner interviews several forest defenders, as I mentioned, but it also interviewed Tortuguita, who was killed by police on January 18th in a raid that became increasingly common at the turn of this year after this article came out.
Right.
And then there was another article published in the Bitter Southerner called Little Turtle's War that was published on January 20th, right after he was murdered, where the author sort of reflects on how he got to know them and some of the ways that the author learned from them.
Right.
So what stuck out to you from these two pieces?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that and sort of the update as to where we are and sort of the work that is being waged against these forest defenders, right? And it's a shame. It really is. But, I'm really glad you found these pieces. I thought they were really great. And I think sort of working in tandem, they paint a really great picture of what's going on in Atlanta with this Stop Cop City movement, and sort of the myriad of reasons why this movement is so important, and also the connected issues surrounding the movement, right? And so I very much so enjoyed reading these pieces, getting to dive into and learn more about what's going on here, because it was something that I was sort of vaguely familiar with in the ether, right, and what was happening on social media, but this really gave me a good glimpse into what's going on. So I'm glad we get to sort of amplify that here on our podcast. The one of the biggest things that stood out to me is one of the most baffling issues at play here for me is the fact that this training facility that the Atlanta Police Department wants to build is going to cost $90 million, right? And a third of that money, I can't remember which piece said this, but a third of the money is going to be coming from taxpayers.
Yep.
Which, is just wild, right? It's a wild price tag for something that we know isn't in the best interest of the people of Atlanta or in the best interest of what true public safety is and should be.
Yeah.
It's a wild price tag for something that was opened to public comment by the city council, right? And received an overwhelming majority of comments that were opposed to the construction of this training facility.
Yeah, they had to do 2 days of comments because it took 17 hours of comments.
Right.
Most of which were negative.
Right? And so despite that, right, it continues to sort of push forward, and it has the backing of the Atlanta Police Foundation, and we have talked about the power of police foundations here before, so not surprised there. But I ultimately think it's wild that cities like Atlanta, where there has been and continues to be police brutality and violence, murders by the police against marginalized communities, that cities like Atlanta continue to push for more investment in the police as opposed to what this city, all of our cities, all of us really need, right? I think sort of as I read these pieces and processed that, to me, it's really just sort of shameful and reckless and scary, especially given what it means for the residents of Atlanta, but certainly what precedent this could set, and what it could mean for cities across our country.
Yeah, and I think one of the you mentioned the Atlanta Police Foundation. And the major donors for the Atlanta Police Foundation are, huge corporations that are in it. I think headquartered in Atlanta. Yeah, like the Cox family, the media, Cox Media. There's, I think, Coca-Cola is a major donor, and some other big names too. But the thing that I think both articles pointed out is that the Atlanta newspaper is owned by Cox Media and has overwhelmingly been publishing sort of positive pieces about this plan without disclosing that, right, like the ownership connection to the plan.
Absolutely.
As a board member, I think, on the Atlanta Police Foundation.
Yeah, so talk about a conflict of interest there.
Yeah, and not reporting it, not being transparent about it. Interesting.
That's a good word for it.
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to talk about is the environmental impacts of this proposed training facility. And so I have a couple quotes. The first one's from the Prism article, not prison, Prism. Quote, "The city is leasing 85 acres of the Weelaunee Forest, land originally stolen from the Muskogee Creek people, to the Atlanta Police Foundation for Cop City. But it is located in a majority black area of DeKalb County outside of city limits, resulting in significant disenfranchisement of its residents who have few easily accessible official channels to register their dissent. While Cop City would impact everyone in Atlanta and across the country, it will have especially disastrous ramifications for nearby residents, who will lose the benefit of the forest's flood prevention and cooling impacts. Indeed, this is land that the city referred to in 2017 as one of the, quote, 4 lungs of Atlanta and slated for incorporation into a broader set of parkland. A promise the city broke just 4 years later."
Yeah.
So there's this environmental impact of what happens when green space is developed and the long-term impact of removing trees on the air. And then there is more based on the history of the use of this land from when it was known as the Atlanta Prison Farm.
It was a prison farm, right?
So there's a story in the Bitter Southerner article about Leroy Horton, who was arrested for public drunkenness and sentenced to 20 days at the prison farm. So not a huge,
just
not a
days,
huge crime,
but
not a huge issue, not a big sentence. He then got lice. And was told to shower and given a shampoo. And then he was told to disinfect his clothes with a chemical called sulfotep that ended up killing him. Because he had it sprayed directly onto his bare back by another person who was also serving a sentence locally in the prison farm. And this brings me to the next possible environmental impact: the buried contamination, which would likely be uncovered by the development of Cop City.
Yes.
And so here's a quote from the Bitter Southerner article. "One of the chemicals that hasn't been investigated is the sulfotep that killed Leroy Horton. The EPA classifies it as an environmental hazard. The National Center for Biotechnology Information warns, do not let this chemical enter the environment, and recommends that anyone undertaking cleanup wear, quote, complete protective clothing, including a self-contained breathing apparatus." So we have multiple environmental impacts here. One that's longer term and maybe harder to measure is the removal of trees,
Right.
as one of the 4 lungs of Atlanta. But then also, what does it mean to churn up earth and then in these 2 nearby rivers of this forest land have this chemical that killed a man just leaked out into the environment? What's the bigger environmental impact on the ecosystem there too?
Absolutely.
So there's all of these different things that I think are and as the article said, they haven't studied for how much of that chemical is present in that soil.
Well, there's so much about that was fascinating to me too. I was really amazed to learn about the environmental impacts of the potential construction of this facility.
Yeah.
I think both pieces do a great job. The Bitter Southerner piece really was so detailed and thorough in sort of examining and explaining the impact of, like you talked about, the loss of trees in that area and what that means for the city, what that means for the residents in that area. This increased temperatures, the flooding you talked about, the chemicals that are there, right? The pollution of waterways. There's so much that this facility would do to that area that is sort of unconscionable, really.
Yeah.
And it sounds like the developers of the training facility haven't really done their full due diligence, right? And studies to sort of research and understand the full impact of the construction of this facility and what that would be, right? And so I think all of that is just, and certainly that story of Leroy Horton just kind of broke my heart. And I can't imagine that we want people around sort of that chemical hazard, right? And that to be released into the environment. And so, I think all of that is just another truly shameful aspect of all of this, right? And the fact that this police training facility represents both, I think, a commitment to state-sanctioned violence and to the degradation of our planet, right, is real, right, and exacerbates what is a very real climate crisis for us. And so it's just all of that stood out to me too as just another reason in the long list of reasons why this facility is not needed.
Yeah, because I forget all the numbers, but it's a big chunk of land, this forest, and this training facility would take, I think, 90 acres. And so it would leave a whole lot of more forested area. But the impact on that is so big that I don't know, like it doesn't weigh out, like it doesn't make sense once you weigh all that out.
Absolutely.
So, that's one of the things that really stuck out to me as a reason to oppose this, aside from the other things.
Yeah, right.
Like, do they need sort of a fake city to practice urban warfare tactics in? No, probably not.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And you're right. Maybe that's a way in for folks. Like maybe if you can't, if you have this vision for, and you can see how, or you believe that the police need a facility like this to do training, right? If you're not there yet where we are as it relates to abolition, right? Like thinking about the environmental impacts of this, like, that alone to me is warranting not doing this for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then the next part that I wanted to talk about was connecting back to our discussion of direct action and legal strategy and the way they have to go hand in hand.
Oh, cool.
From a few weeks back in the Hammer and Hope article that we talked about. And so this comes from a quotation from Tortuguita in the Bitter Southerner article. They said, "It's incredibly important to continue having popular support. Cop City is incredibly unpopular already. We're very popular. We're cool." They laughed as they said that last bit, but without a doubt, the movement has succeeded in painting the forest defenders as a scrappy, idealistic David battling a heartless, moneyed Goliath. We get a lot of support from people who live here, and that's important because we win through nonviolence. We're not going to beat them at violence, but we can beat them in public opinion, in the courts even.
Yes.
And I truly believe we've got to understand how to support these movements from the outside when we can't be on the ground, because we can't be on the ground because we're not in Georgia, we're not in Atlanta.
Right.
but these folks in particular are creating their own conditions for liberation.
Yes.
They're operating outside of norms of land ownership and renting and looking out for one another. And they're in connection with our discussion about our anarchism last week.
Yeah.
They're working together autonomously without hierarchy.
Yeah, I loved that. Yeah.
And so they're finding ways to practice community together by hosting readings and dinners and concerts in the forest and looking out for one another. And I think there's a lot of beauty in the way that they're doing that. That part of all of this is really amazing.
Yeah, part of that is getting to what I am bringing to the table as application. So I'm not going to say too much there, but I loved reading more about the forest defenders and sort of how they structured themselves, what they believe in, sort of holding fast and true to that. And the ways in which, as you talk about, that they take care of each other and they stay committed to this work. And in a lot of ways, they're also putting themselves in harm's way, right? And so they take that very seriously. I mean, everyone that got interviewed for this piece, they use pseudonyms, right?
There weren't any photos. There were lots of really great photos.
Yes, in the
piece, but no photos of people's faces.
Exactly, right? And even, I think, was it the concert that they hosted that, community members came to, but a lot of the actual forest defenders didn't come to because they were worried about being in people's photos, right, and having their face out there. So, right, there's an element of, really important thinking and strategizing that they've done to take care of each other and take care of themselves. But the way in which they are in community together and working together is, as you say, it's really beautiful. So I'm glad you brought that up. I've got more about that coming soon. The other thing I want to talk to you about, and I don't know that I have a fully formed thought here with this, is I struggled a little bit when I was reading both of these pieces, and especially with the Prism piece, and there was a piece that the Prism piece linked to, and it was the talks around the support for this training facility, right? That came in during that very long city council meeting that we talked about earlier, and I guess I just wanted to name my struggle with that here. The Prism article and the piece that it linked to pointed out how support for the police training facility came from residents of a largely white and wealthy neighboring community in Atlanta. It also came from firefighters, and it also came from police officers. And that support and those folks used and propagandized the need for this training facility to help police deal with, the quote unquote rise in crime. I think they said uptick in crime, and prioritize their feelings of safety over the overwhelming destruction that ultimately I think would come from this facility, right? And it just really didn't sit well with me, right? Like this disconnect that exists in our lived experiences and our ability to try to understand and find ways that actually protect and serve the true humanity of all of us. That disconnect was just a bit hard to sort of sit with and understand that folks would go out of their way and present those arguments and not really think about, the humanity of folks in this situation and what it really means,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there's so much about not understanding the long-term ramifications of something and seeing the short-term and I don't know, not it's so prevalent. Our thinking around safety is so prevalent, like it's so interconnected with police.
Yes.
And having a strong police system, and there's ties to imperialism there. Where and the whole U.S. Frame of mind of speaking softly and carrying a big stick, and having a the largest military budget in the world by several factors of funding. All of these things are kind of interconnected as we think about the physical safety of people, and it's hard to parse all of that out. And so it's not surprising to me that people show up and support stuff like this because they're like, well, they got to be trained. But I remember one of the things in one of the people in the Bitter Southerner article talking about how this could be an effective response to police violence is a training facility where they get to do more training. And I was like, but I don't know that that's those things aren't connected. this training facility mostly seems to be focused on like driving, like a driving facility, gun range,
Yes.
and like this fake city where they're going to be able to practice. None of that is going to help people de-escalate things, help police de-escalate a situation.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure that connecting those dots to police violence in Atlanta to this being a necessary response to that makes any sense to me.
It doesn't at all. Absolutely. Thanks for that sort of more fully formed thought and contribution to, my struggle there.
Well, I think it's so, I don't know, it's so ingrained. It's so hard to parse out that stuff of what safety actually means, what that actually looks like for most of us.
Yes.
Right? And this is why we talk about it a lot. And the police and how intertwined the thinking of those two things are for us collectively.
Right. 100%.
Yeah. All right. Well, this feels like a good spot to shift and talk about application.
All right.
How does this conversation, how do these articles apply to our day-to-day lives? My application for this week is a quote from an anonymous forest defender that's in the Bitter Southerner article.
Okay.
They say, quote, "The intersection between the climate crisis, growing inequality, and the militarization of cops is emblematic here. But it's a problem everywhere." This is exactly right. We continue to allow the so-called free market to develop and develop and develop and develop, and that has an environmental impact that we don't measure, we don't consider.
Right.
So whether it's tree removal and the impact of our air quality or unearthing toxic chemicals that have been buried for decades, those are all issues. And then that development requires militarized cops to protect the value and investment of the wealthy folks who pushed for that development in the first place. So they take their wealth and invest in cops through police foundations, which expand surveillance. And this is a cycle that just repeats itself and keeps going. And so one of the things that the Prism article talked about is the connection, as I said earlier, is the connection between the response to the 1996 or the Olympic Games and the lead up to the Games in 96 in the ways that forced kind of development and gentrification of two specific areas in Atlanta that were then used for the Games pushed out Black residents and pushed out sort of working class communities and the connection to that now today and the ways that police get used as tools to make that development happen. Right. And so that's where my application comes in, is that this is a cycle that's happening in a lot of places in the United States, in a lot of places in the world. And so we have to understand how that process works to be able to do anything about it and to say anything about it and to try to stop it. Absolutely.
Yeah. It's interesting to consider the ways in which the police are used as this force and enforcer of this vicious cycle, right? And the sort of interconnectedness of, like you say, the climate, and the quote said, the climate crisis and inequality is wild. It really is, right? And so to me, it's another reason why, I appreciate the work that they're doing to try to, the movement work that's happening, try to stop this, right? And because if this is allowed to happen in Atlanta, I'm worried that it'll be, easier to be done and replicated in other places.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's some good application. I alluded to this earlier. I was thinking about application and thinking about the work of the forest defenders, actually. And I couldn't help but be a little bit hopeful in thinking about movements and organizing work and the work that they are doing with the Stop Cop City movement. I think it's incredible what they have done, what the folks who are part of this movement have done, and thinking about what it is that they've sacrificed, right? And some of them have sacrificed their lives, as you talked about, right? And so this quote at the end of the Prism piece stood out to me and really sort of summed up my thinking about the application from these pieces. It said this, quote, "While Atlanta's posture towards its most vulnerable has held steady for decades, the Stop Cop City movement is here to stay. The movement has the potential not just to stop the destruction of the forest and the construction of a deadly police playground, but also to begin reversing the transformation that has for so long held our communities ransom. When we fight, we win." Right? And that's the hope that I want to hold on to and use in sort of our continued work here, our conversations here, and our continued fight against all these things in our society that are actively, at conflict with our collective humanity.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good stuff. I think that sort of overall process or posture of like how do we collectively engage with and fight for this, even when we're not on the ground.
Yes, it's important. Absolutely.
All right. So how about homework?
How about it?
What are we going to continue to learn about? What are we doing to continue to learn about this after our conversation today? So there's a toolkit that was produced by Southern Crossroads called Mourn and Organize. It was written in the wake of Tortuguita's murder and gives some additional context for what the plans for Cop City are, makes some connections between Atlanta and small towns across the South and why those things are, why standing up to Cop City in Atlanta ultimately is helpful to small towns across the South.
Yeah.
And includes a connection to the murder of Tyree Nichols in Memphis to stop Cop City.
Okay.
As well in that this movement to what happened there. So there's political and popular education happening in this document, and a script to use to call or email folks and a list of folks who you can contact who are involved in this project in one way or another in terms of pushing it forward. So it's a way to try to interrupt it or slow it down from continuing to happen.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. I hadn't heard of that one. My homework is similar in the sense that I totally forgot that you had sent me a copy of the Stop Cop City Action Guide that our friends over at Surge produced, right? And so I wanted to sort of check that out and really dive into it. And sort of similarly, I think it's a great way to learn more about the movement to stop the creation of this training facility, but also how to get involved in the movement and the work, how you can sort of donate money, where you can donate money to support the movement. And so it seems to be a really incredible resource to learn more about what's going on here. So I definitely want to check out that toolkit and certainly Southern Crossroads toolkit as well. If you want to find the Surge toolkit, you can just Google Surge Stop Cop City Toolkit, and it's literally the first thing that pops up. And it's not terribly long, but it has got some incredible resources in it. So I got some good homework for this weekend, some toolkits to check out. I love it. Very good.
Yeah, good stuff. All right. Well, Damien, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I am. All right. So for next week, I'm going to bring a couple of articles to the table for us. And many thanks to you, my friend, for suggesting that we talk about this because it's timely and important. Both of these articles that I found focus on the recent anti-trans legislation that's currently being discussed and passed in places like Florida and Tennessee. And certainly the potential impact this legislation in these places could and will have on other states and on our country as a whole. Though right before we started recording, I saw a notification, an alert. I don't remember who it was from, maybe HuffPost, that Kentucky's governor just vetoed some anti-trans legislation there. So we might bring that into the conversation too. That's good news, right? But there's certainly work to be done. But the two pieces that I'm bringing to the table are one from the New Republic called Florida GOP's new anti-trans bill is so extreme it could ban treatment for breast cancer. And the other is from NPR and is called The Anti-Drag Bills Sweeping the U.S. Are Straight from History's Playbook.
Yep.
And so they both appear to be really great pieces. I'm sure we'll bring in other pieces to our discussion as well. But again, I think I'm looking forward to talking about this issue, what's happening. As I said, it's very timely. It's happening right now. And it's something we all need to sort of wrap our heads around and understand what's happening and see what it is that we might be able to do about it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for finding these two articles. I think it's important that we keep talking about this and bringing it up.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So with that, We want to thank you for joining us today and for listening to Interdependent Study. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, follow us on social media, sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we got going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. We'll talk to you next week.